We'll call him Timothy, for that was not his name. He was one of a number of sons and daughters that were born to a family that had come from Ireland in search of usable farmland and found it on a farm west of the Mississippi River. There Timothy and his brothers and sisters were born and grew up, eating well, laughing loud, working hard. And some of them farm the land today, and if the world had turned around differently, why, Timothy's descendants might be among 'em, growing grey hair and complaining that it wasn't like the good old days. But as Timothy grew to young manhood, he was aware that there was going on in Europe a great war against an unpleasant chap known as the Kaiser. And all the older folks would talk about how it was probably the mistakes of the English that had led to all the trouble. Sure, the younger men all thought it would be a good thing if they got a chance to go over to Europe and have a word with the Kaiser and maybe teach him the error of his ways. And as the winter of 1917 turned into the winter of 1918, and Timothy himself turned 18 years old, sure, he did get a letter from the President of the United States confirming that they were looking for a few good Irishmen to go and talk to the Kaiser, and would Timothy be interested in coming to the induction center in the big city and being tested to see if he was worthy to go chat with the Kaiser himself. So they bought Timothy a train ticket, and there was a farewell party with speeches and tears and food and songs. And Timothy headed off to the city to be verified as one of the Irishmen who was needed to go and take care of the Kaiser. But when Timothy arrived in the big city, he didn't find things exactly the way he'd expected. Sure, they did find him a way to get to the induction center, which was an old warehouse that had no heat and had been adapted pretty quickly, so that Timothy spent an unpleasant day walking around stark naked through this big warehouse, going to this doctor to be poked and that doctor to be asked questions and this doctor to be shown a bunch of letters of the alphabet on the wall. And as Timothy had expected, he was verified as 1A and perfectly fit to go and teach the Kaiser what for. But they weren't quite sure they wanted Timothy for that job. You see, every government is filled with people who say yes and people who say no. And there were plenty of people saying, you know, this war might be just about over. How many more Irishmen do we want to feed? So Timothy was told that although he was perfectly fit to join the army, they didn't have any positions open for him. Would he come back in 2 weeks? Well, the price of a train ticket from the farm, which was a goodly distance away from the big city, was a major investment. And he'd only bought a one-way ticket in the first place. So rather than send for money to home, he wrote a letter to the folks and told him how things were and how he just thought he'd stay in the city for a couple of weeks and maybe next time around they'd want him for the job. In the meantime, he'd find himself a job of work and a place to eat and a place to sleep, and he'd let him know when he set off to meet the Kaiser. Well, Timothy was able to find a place to work. It wasn't perhaps what you'd call the best sort of jobs, because nobody really wanted to give long-term employment to a young man who was leaving to see the Kaiser any day now. But Timothy knew all the working parts of a shovel, and he knew how to handle a hoe and a hammer and a saw. So he was able to get short-term jobs, 3 days here, 2 days there. The money wasn't good, but there was places to go. He found a boarding hall, an old 2-story building, where the first floor had been turned into a huge dining hall and a little parlor off to the side. And knowing that there was money to be made in young men coming to the city, they had taken an old storeroom in the basement and turned it into a bedroom. And here, for a small amount of money, Timothy was allowed to sleep. It was a little cold, it was dark. There was one window high on the wall, but that was blocked with snow when he moved into it. But this was not a problem. There was plenty of blankets, and by that time of the night he was ready to go to sleep and rest his sore muscles for the next day's work. But the one thing that got to him was that it was kind of a lonely life in the city. I mean, he'd get to know the men he worked with. They'd give him a hard time at first, but he had uncles back home who treated him the same way, so there was no problem there. He'd get to know 'em and get to working with 'em, but then after 4 days, you'd have to go start with a whole new group of men and start from new again. And Timothy was used to having people to talk to, people to argue with, people to sing with. And there was nothing like that at work. But there was some measure of companionship at the breakfast table, and at the dinner table it was the best of all, because nobody had to leave for work. If there were people waiting to eat their dinner, he could retire to the parlor with 1 or 2 people, and there were certain people who would be there every time when Timothy sat down to dinner. There'd be some middle-aged men, pale of skin and dark of suit, men who worked in offices, and from the way they didn't speak to anyone at the table, certainly not to Timothy, he suspected they worked in them offices with signs in the window that said "No Irish need apply." And there was a fierce old woman who always sat at the head table. The way she looked at Timothy told him that she didn't like the Irish, she didn't like farm boys, she didn't like men, she didn't like people breathing her air. He didn't look her direction if he could help it. But there was also some fair young damsels who had jobs in the city, and these fair young girls would sit together at one end of the table, and sometimes they'd look at Timothy and they'd giggle. He knew what they were seeing, a farm boy fresh from the countryside, but he didn't care for that. The lady who can giggle is a lady who can smile, and if you can make a lady smile, well, then you've got a chance, haven't you? There was also always at the table an old Jewish peddler who had pushed his cart up and down the streets of the city for years, and he had always stories to tell. Something that had happened 30 years ago, or something that had happened that afternoon. And though his lingo was a little hard for Timothy to get used to at first, well, Timothy liked a good story, and the old man liked a listener. And the stories were interesting enough that sometimes one of the fair young girls would come down and have a listen. So Timothy was always glad of a story. So he lived a fairly reasonable life. It was a good schedule. It was not all that hard. Although sometimes he'd wonder. Every 2 weeks he'd go to the induction center, and every 2 weeks it was the same thing. "You're perfectly fit, but we don't need you this week. Come back in 2 weeks." And he started to wonder how long this was going to go on. Was this war going to be over before he got a chance to play? Was this what he'd been made for, just 3 days of work here and 4 days of work there? And he wondered if he'd ever get to exchange more than, say, 6 words with any of the fair young ladies. And what with one thing and another, sometimes he'd be lying awake at night when he should have been sleeping. And one night, when the winter was turning to spring, he was lying awake thinking about the war and whether it was going to last long enough for him. And it came to his mind that he was hearing music. He'd heard something like a flute earlier in the evening, but he just figured that was the wind in the trees. And he'd heard drum sounds, but he just said that was the wind taking those boards and the fence around the vacant lot that was next door to the boarding house. But now he could have sworn he heard a fiddle. And what's more, the fiddle and the flute and the drum were playing a tune that he could have almost sworn he knew. It would catch at his mind, and then it'd be gone, and then he'd not be sure he'd heard it. Finally, he threw off his blankets and climbed up onto the bed and pulled himself up to the window and looked outside at the yard. The snow had melted enough for him to see. And for a while he saw nothing particular about the fence around the vacant lot. But as he watched, he was a patient man, Timothy. Every now and then he'd see a young man, or a young woman, or a young man with a young woman, come up to the fence, stand at a gap in the fence, and then be gone. He didn't see him walk through the fence. They were just gone at once. And this puzzled Timothy, and he was willing to take a look at a mystery. So he put on his clothes and his jacket and his cap, and he slipped out the side door of the boarding house and walked very slowly and carefully up toward the vacant lot and the fence. As he was doing this, another young man came by from another direction, and not seeing Timothy, went up to the fence, stood there for a moment at the gap in the fence, and then disappeared. But now Timothy saw the clothes of the young man were lying on the ground, as if the man had left them behind. Timothy was not quite sure what he thought of this, so instead of going to the gap in the fence, he went a ways down the fence and put his eye to a crack between boards. And he saw a strange sight in the vacant lot. The lot was dark. There was some moon showing down on it, but the moon seemed to have taken a liking to the bottom 2 or 3 feet of the vacant lot. Up to knee-high on a man, it was as bright as day. And in this cloud of brightness, there was flowers waving back and forth. Sure, spring hadn't gone that far. Timothy saw not a flower on his side of the fence. But as he looked, he realized the flowers were not waving back and forth in the wind. Sure, they were dancing. They were moving around each other. They were moving up and down the field, making circles and turning around each other and joining leaves, and it looked like a good time. And now he really could hear the music, and it was dance music, and suddenly it didn't seem quite so risky to walk to the gap in the fence, so Timothy strolled right on over, and he put a hand on the fence at the one side of the gap, and then for a moment he didn't know what was going on. Things were tumbling all around him, and when he looked around, there were the clothes of his body lying on the ground next to a little puddle of snow. And he realized what had happened, and he looked down at himself to find out what kind of flower he'd been turned into. And wasn't he just a potato? A potato? To dance with flowers? This didn't seem make any sort of sense at all. He looked around at the violets and the lilies of the valley and the roses and the daisies and saw not a potato among them. And he looked down, and the clothes of his body were gone, and he was trying to think what he should do next. Maybe take a run for the boarding house and see if he couldn't find some spare clothes in his suitcase. But as he was sitting there, making up his mind, a little green shoot came around the fence and took hold of one of the streamers that had been his hands, and took hold and drew him through the fence. And he looked up to see what was interfering with his calamity. And he looked right up into the face of the bluest little old cornflower he'd ever seen, whose eyes were the bluest blue, and looking straight into his own eyes. She didn't spake. Flowers don't spake, do they? But she drew him into the dance. And suddenly it seemed to him not a bad thing for a potato to dance with a cornflower. And he danced the dance with her, and he knew the song they were playing, he knew the steps. Everything came to him at once, and it seemed a natural thing for him and the cornflower to be moving among the roses and the lilies of the valley. They did one dance, the dance turned into a second, and the second dance turned into a third and a fourth. And as they whirled around the yard, it seemed to him once in a while that a flower or two would go missing. And he'd see that they were moving to the far side of the field where there was another gap in the fence. Well, this didn't concern him. He was having a good time. The music was wonderful, and there were those eyes of the bluest blue looking down into his. And she led him through the dance, and she led him through 7 or 8 more dances, and gradually she led him to the other side of the field, where she took him out into the darkness on the other side of the fence. And it was cold there, and there was a wind blowing on him, and looking down he found that, although the clothes had not returned to his body, he was a young man again. And looking at the cornflower, he found a woman there, and what happened next is no more your business than it is any of mine. But when Timothy woke in the morning, sure the smile of his face was as broad as the sky above him, and bright as the sun that was shining down on him. He looked around, he found that the clothes were back on his body, and he was lying flat on his back in the yard beyond the fence around the vacant lot. Only one thing was lacking. He could not find the cap to his head. And one thing he did find that he didn't remember. In one pocket he found a dainty little slipper, just as blue as it could be, a dancing slipper, and he looked at it, and he thought back, and he thought, well, that's a fair swap. And he was content, but the sun was high, and he was aware that it was getting late for breakfast at the boarding house, and he suddenly realized the hunger was on him, and he decided he'd better run back if he wanted any breakfast at all, for today was another one of those days he had to go to the induction center, and you wanted to be well fed if you were going to be walking around starters. So he hurried back to the boarding house, and he started up the stairs. And of course, who should be coming down the stairs but that serious old school teacher of a woman who wouldn't look at him. And she started down the stairs, and he had no cap to tip to her, so he just pulled on his forelock and went to rush around her. But he didn't make it, for she put out a hand, and she held him still on the stairs, and she stared into his face and said to him, "Young man, you left your cap." And in her hand was the cap of his head. And he looked into her face for the first time since he'd ever seen her, and found that she had eyes of the bluest blue. And a trembling hand went into his pocket, and he brought out the little blue dancing slipper. I'm thinking this must be yours, then?" "Thank you," she said, and she took it from him, and left the cap in his hand, and walked down the stairs and off down the sidewalk as if she was the queen of the big city, and everyone knew it. Timothy stared after her, but he heard a bell and knew he'd be lucky to get any breakfast at all at this point. There'd be time at the dinner table to ask questions, if he had the nerve. And he went in and had breakfast, and wouldn't you know it, that's always the way it works, this was the day that the folks at the induction center said, "Very well, you're in the army now." So they took Timothy and they shipped him off to a camp far from the big city, where they gave him a uniform and a rifle, and a lot of lessons on how to take care of both of these things. And then he stayed in camp for a while, just doing whatever the army could think of to use up his time. For the war was continuing in Europe, but they still weren't quite convinced they needed more Irishmen. And what with one thing and another, time went by, and finally Timothy and a bunch of the other men at the camp got the word that, "Well, we don't need you after all. Thank you for coming by. Go home." Timothy did not go home. He'd been talking with this man and that man. You get to talking to men in the camp. And there was jobs going in another big city farther away. And this man knew another man who knew another man who could sure use a man like Timothy in his business. And what with one thing and another, it was a long time before Timothy made it back to the big city where he had spent that cold, lonely winter. And when he went back, it was not with a cap on his head. He wore a hat with a broad brim, and he carried a sample case, for he was one of the best salesmen in his company. They trusted him to sell their goods in cities around the United States, and one day they sent him to the big city where he had waited for the army to make up its mind. And he did his job there, and then he went down to the old neighborhood to see if any of his friends were still down there. But the world had turned around while Timothy was off becoming a salesman. And where the vacant lot where he had danced as a potato had been was now a service station selling gasoline to people with automobiles. And where the boarding house had been, there was now a vacant lot. And he went round to the shops and to the pubs, and he asked questions, but sure there was no one there who could tell him a thing. None of them remembered the boarding house, nor yet the vacant lot, certainly, nor the old Jewish peddler, nor the fair young girls, nor that serious old woman with eyes of the bluest blue.